The Sinixt are a First Nations people. The Sinixt are descended from indigenous peoples who have lived primarily in what are today known as the West Kootenay region of British Columbia in Canada and the adjacent regions of eastern Washington in the United States for at least 10,000 years. The Cynics are of Salishan linguistic extraction and speak their own dialect of the Colville-Okanagan language. Today they live primarily on the Colville Indian Reservation in Washington, where they form part of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, which is recognized by the United States government as an American Indian tribe. Many Cynics continue to live in the traditional territory on the northern side of the 49th parallel, particularly in the Salishan Valley, and scattered amongst neighboring tribes throughout BC. However, the Canadian government declared the Cynics extinct in 1956. History. Traditional territory. In her anthropological study of the Cynics in Canada, Keeping the Lakes Way, Paula Price notes that, despite their obscurity in Canada and the scattered documentation of the presence in the area, both archival and published material show that the Cynics interior Salish resided along the Columbia River, Arrow Lakes, Salishan Valley, and parts of Kootenay Lake. Other tribes used the Columbia as a trade route, passing through Cynics territory to trade with the Cynics and to trade further south. Parts of the traditional territory of the Cynics are being claimed by the West Bank Band of the Okanagan people and by the Katanaksa. There is controversy over the historic claims to the area. Traditional life. According to Lonnie Reyes, the Cynics numbered about 3,000 in the early 19th century, divided into several bands of sizes suited to hunting and fishing. He distinguishes the Upper Cynics around the Arrow Lakes, above Revelstoke and around the Castlegower Trail, and Salishan Valley area from the Lower Cynics in the Northport, Bossburg, Marcus, and Kettle Falls area in Washington state. The latter constituted at least 8 large bands. Once they obtained horses, they ranged farther east to hunt on the Great Plains. In prehistoric times, the Cynics were a semi-sedentary people living in warm, semi-subterranean houses for the winter months. Summers were spent fishing, hunting, and gathering other food resources in the mountain and lake-dominated homeland. Reyes says that they wintered in the more wind-sheltered valleys but summered by the Columbia. Scholars have classified the Cynics as complex collectors. Sharon Montgomery of the Nakusp Museum, and tribal legend documented by Nancy Perkins Winnacoop and Nettie Winnacoop Clark described the Cynics as the mother tribe of the Pacific Northwest, Salish. In a recent interview with the journalist Rex Whaler, Bob Campbell, headman of the Cynics in British Columbia, notes that, as the mother nation, we often settle disputes among the bands. Contributors to the article's forum refuted the claims as being without ethnographic or historical foundation. Cynics mitochondrial DNA can be found at the base of Native American haplogroup B2. Early white explorers reported the Cynics to be of average height and size, with hazel eyes. They were adept in making suspended bridges over the narrow, swift-flowing Columbia, and skillful at fishing. The staples included huckleberry, salmon, and roots, but they also ate black moss, other berries, hazelnuts, wild carrots, peppermint, and various game meats. They chewed pine pitch like gum, and had a range of herbal medicines. Starting in June, mature salmon arrived at Kettle Falls, the farthest downriver that the Cynics territory extended. The Cynics caught only the salmon that were not strong enough to clear the falls, ensuring that the strongest went on to spawn. Both bands traveled to Red Mountain near Rossland, BC to harvest huckleberries in August. These seasonal events figured prominently in the culture. They hunted in late autumn, but still often were short of food by late winter. The Upper Cynics trained dogs to drive deer toward the Columbia River, where hunters in canoes shot them with bow and arrow. The Cynics used the distinctive sturgeon-nosed canoe, about 15 to 17 feet long, with a cedar frame covered by large slabs of pine bark, riding low in the water with downward sloping tips to reduce wind resistance. Reyes says that they often intermarried with the Swhyayalpu, who had a very similar language. The territory of the latter was largely in the Colville Valley and intersected Cynics territory at Cattle Falls. Reyes gives an account of various Cynics customs, especially related to pregnancy, birth, and education, as well as some descriptions of funerary customs. Children were closely monitored by elders. Children were sent on short excursions to search for protective spirits. They were usually required to bring back an object to prove that they had made the journey. As they grew older, until puberty, these journeys became longer. Each person was expected to acquire multiple spirits, because each had different powers. At about the age of 6, the children began to be instructed in the legends of the tribe and family history, tribal ways and tribal laws. At 8 or 9, they learned to swim and to run long distances. Boys were taught to make and use weapons and fishing gear, while girls started to learn plant lore and tanning, as well as how to care for young children, maintain dwellings, and prepare meals. Cynics' religion was mainly for harnessing power. The sun, the stars, the water, and the different animals each had different powers. The whole tribe was led by one head chief, but each smaller village of 50 to 200 had a local chief, whom they called a thinker. These thinkers would come together to form a council. The Cynics were a matrilocal people, with newly married couples living with the wife's family rather than the husband's. Late pre-contact smallpox, instability. There is historical evidence suggesting that the Cynics were heavily depopulated by 1 or 2 smallpox epidemics that preceded the arrival of Scottish Nemi-Acutis fur traders of the Northwest Company. The epidemic of 1781 was likely the biggest single outbreak, with accounts of that epidemic describing a mortality rate up to 80%. David Thompson and other early traders noticed the pockmarked faces of older Cynics and heard oral accounts of the epidemic. There is also evidence that the Cynics were seriously affected by the major political upheavals that preceded the arrival of the Europeans. The Kaitanaxa people who neighbored the Cynics to the east were driven further into the mountains by the Blackfoot, who had obtained control of Kaitanaxa territory in the foothills and northwestern plains. Ethnographic and historical evidence suggests the Kaitanaxa and the Cynics battled each other over the territory along the lower Kootenay River, between the present cities of Nelson and Castlegar, British Columbia. The Kaitanaxa were considered the intruders, and the dispute was reportedly ended after the Cynics mounted a large-scale raid into Kaitanaxa territory at the south end of Kootenay Lake. The Cynics later renewed the historic peace with the Kaitanaxa and took common cause with them: the Kalispel, the Flathead, the Coeur d'Alene, the Spokane, the Nez Perce, and others against the Blackfoot. While the Cynics never directly fought the Blackfoot as a group, it is very likely that individual Cynics joined the Salishan neighbors in war parties and buffalo hunts through the western plains. Reyes says they had ongoing skirmishes with the Blackfoot, from whom, according to him, they stole horses. They also took part with other regional peoples in the punitive expedition in 1838 against the SDATIMC of Seat and Lake led by Nicola, chief of the Nicola people. They were allied with the interior tribes led by the Nyakapamiks, who were assembled at Lytton during the Fraser Canyon War of 1858. Fur trade, missionaries, and border dispute. The Cynics and their allies had a very close relationship with the Hudson's Bay Company. They wintered near the major trading post at Colville for the first time in 1830–31, led by the Lower Cynics chief C. Welken. The Cynics supported the company in its efforts to prevent American trappers and settlers from entering and taking over the territory. As fur traders, the Cynics were among the most prolific of all the First Nations who traded at Fort Colville. In 1837, Jesuit missionaries arrived in the area. St. Paul's Mission at Kettle Falls was constructed with the help of Colville and Cynics labor. According to Reyes, it was in the 1840s that the Cynics experienced a major die-off, shrinking from about 3,000 to about 400 during the period of Chief King Kano, nephew of C. Welken. In addition to suffering diseases and incursions on the land, they found the salmon runs began to diminish because of the development of commercial fisheries at Astoria, Oregon, near the mouth of the Columbia River. Some saw the die-off as a failure of the powers of their traditional religion. King Kano was among the eventual converts to Catholicism. One people, two countries. When the United States gained formal control of the Oregon country south of the 49th parallel in 1846, some Cynics remained in American territory near Kettle Falls, where Fort Colville continued to operate. Kettle Falls was essentially the southern boundary of Cynics territory, and was shared with the Colville people. They were traditionally close to the Colville people, who celebrated the Cynics' arrival at the falls during fishing season with a three-day dance. The tribes had a three-day dance at the end of the season. In the wake of the partition, the Hudson's Bay Company created Fort Shepherd, British Columbia, just upstream from the confluence of the Penderey and Columbia rivers, which was very near the border. In order to serve the former clients and also maintain a post on British territory, adjacent Cynics territory in British Columbia remained in the hands of the Cynics. As late as the 1860s, Cynics leaders still equated British title in the Northern Territory as signifying Cynics sovereignty. When Fort Shepherd was abandoned by the Hudson's Bay Company, for example, it was left in Cynics' hands. Gold, silver rushes. Prospectors began entering Cynics territory in British Columbia in the 1850s and 1860s. Nevertheless, the Cynics managed to maintain effective control over the northern traditional territory through the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s. Despite some conflict, while often accommodating white interests, they continued to claim ownership in British Columbia and resisted the American miners, sometimes by force. In 1865, Cynics blocked 200 miners and mining activities at the confluence of the Columbia and Kootenay rivers in an attempt to protect the hunting and fishing rights as promised by the Crown, as related by Gold Commissioner J.C. Haynes in a letter to the then acting colonial government in Victoria. Haynes reported in Colonial correspondence that the local Indian chief expressed his grievances to mining in the region on at least two separate occasions, and that the Hudson's Bay Company had promised royalties from mining in the area. However, the reduced numbers resulted in the Cynics being unable to control development of the area as it was flooded with miners during a second mineral rush in the 1880s and 1890s. Several boom towns were erected throughout the West Kootenay and Boundary Country regions. The majority of Cynics continued to live in Washington state on the Colville Reservation. Nevertheless, a number of Cynics remained permanently in Canada during the first half of the 20th century. Many others also returned to their ancestral land in BC to hunt and fish during the summer months. Well into the 20th century, King Colonial resigned his role as chief as an old man. He was succeeded by Joseph Cote-Legu, with Andrew Aorpahan and James Bernard as subchiefs. They would succeed him, in turn, as leaders. Colville Confederated Tribes. On the U.S. side, the Colville Confederated Tribes, now the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, were formally established in 1872. They were forced to become wards of the government on the Colville Reservation. It was at this time that the name Cynics to Sinixt was dropped in favor of Lakes, apparently at the behest of the U.S. government. Initially, the Confederated Tribes were given a reservation east of the Columbia River. 3 months later, it was taken away and they were given a comparably large tract on the west side of the river on inferior land. Initially, this reservation extended all the way to the Canadian border, but the northern half was taken away in 1892, which separated it from Cynics' traditional territory in British Columbia. In addition, as more tribes lost the land, the shrinking reservation had to absorb yet more people. Even then, they had to deal with incursions of miners, homesteaders, and settlers such as the Doukhobors, who arrived from Russia in 1912. In 1900, Aorpahan, over James Bernard's objection, agreed to have the land divided into individual allotments rather than held in common. He also agreed to include half-breeds equally in the allocation. Bernard journeyed 3 times to Washington, D.C. on behalf of his people, first in 1890 as interpreter for Chiefs Mikan of the Colvilles, then in 1900 with Chief Lott and Chief Barnaby to negotiate the reservation boundaries, and finally in 1921 as chair of a delegation of the Confederated Tribes. Grand Coulee Dam. Until the construction of Grand Coulee Dam, the Lower Cynics continued to fish in the traditional manner at Kettle Falls. They continued to elect a salmon chief. They fished with baskets on poles that caught the salmon who were not strong enough to clear the falls, and also with spears that had detachable tips, like a harpoon. Reyes sees this as the end of the traditional life of the Colville and Lakes. After the concrete was poured into the steel framework to form the base of the dam, the great salmon runs ended. It brought to a close a great tradition that had existed for centuries. For that day on, there was always a shortage of food. The bands dispersed. The great days of the Cynics were over. A few years later, rising waters from the dam also engulfed the largely Cynics community of Inchelium, Washington on the banks of the Columbia, which had to be relocated, further disrupting even remnants of the traditional way of life. Return to Canada. In her book, Keeping the Lakes Way, B.C., author Paula Price relates stories shared with her by Cynics elders living in Washington state about visiting the Northern Territory from time to time after the extinction, to pick berries, trade fish and visit sacred sites. A permanent Cynics presence was re-established in British Columbia during the late 1980s when, following direction by an elder, a number of Cynics descendants returned to the Salishan Valley to protest road building affecting an important village site, now called the Valakan Heritage Site. A bridge being built at Valakan resulted in a road being placed very near the large Pit House village, an ancient burial site. Since 1989, a permanent Cynics presence continues in the Salishan Valley. with local members overseeing the repatriation of remains and playing an increasing role in local affairs. Archaeology publication in the early 21st century of archaeological work has suggested the traditional society was complex. This is in line with historic, ethnographic, and contemporary Cynics accounts of a socially and economically advanced society. Pit houses in the Salishan Valley are among the earliest very large houses of this type, with some having diameters of over 20 meters. The Salishan Narrows site also included some of the most recent very large pit houses. This and other evidence of a hierarchical and stratified society has led a leading scholar to state that the Cynics society was among the most complex of the entire region. Major hydroelectric projects along the Columbia and Kootenay rivers resulted in the flooding of many graveyards and the majority of Cynics village sites, preventing excavation and study of these historic areas. Status today. The Cynics today live primarily on the Colville Indian Reservation in Washington, where they form part of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, which has governmental recognition as an American Indian tribe. Legal extinction in Canada. Presently, few Cynics live in the traditional territory on the Canadian side of the 49th parallel, and those who do so live in Valakan in the Salishan Valley, or scattered throughout neighboring lands in the area now known as British Columbia. They are not recognized by the Canadian government and were officially declared extinct by Canada in 1956 under the provisions of the Indian Act. When asked about this extinction in 1995, Ron Irwin, then Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, stated that the Arrow Lakes Band ceased to exist as a band for the purpose of the Indian Act. It does not, however, mean that the Cynics ceased to exist as a tribal group. There were more than 250 Cynics in Washington state at the time the Canadian government declared the Cynics extinct, along with other self-identifying Cynics who had relocated with relatives to the Canadian part of the Okanagan region. Some Cynics descendants had joined the Spalmacheen Indian Band of the Secwepemc peoples. Land claims in Canada. Members of Cynics Nation have contested this extinction, and are taking steps to reclaim the land rights in British Columbia, where about 80% of their ancestral territory lies, further complicating the question of Canadian territory claimed by the Cynics to the overlapping claims of Katahnaksa traditional territory. The Katahnaksa Basket Treaty Council is currently negotiating a treaty with the Canadian federal government and the British Columbia provincial government in the region, particularly regarding the lower Kootenay River Valley around Castlegar and Nelson, and all lands within the curve of the Columbia as far north as Coulee Dam and all of the Salishan Valley. In a 1994 presentation to the United Nations, Cynics appointed spokesperson Marilyn James, along with the official Valakan Heritage Site caretaker, Robert Watt, stated that neither our ancestors nor the members of Cynics Nation have ever relinquished our inherent rights to any individual, any government or any other organization, including other native tribes or native nations. Similar to the conflicting Katahnaksa land claims, territorial claims shown on maps published by the Okanagan Nation Alliance, of which the Colville Tribes is the American side member, do not show Cynics territory, instead showing the region as part of Okanagan traditional territory. On July 28, 2008, directors of the Cynics Nation Society have filed a lawsuit claiming Aboriginal title to Crown land in the Kootenays. The lawyer David Aaron describes the intent of the action as asserting a right to be consulted, and to consent to all uses or dispositions of Crown land within the territory, and notes that private lands in the area will not be affected by the claim. Cynics as urban Indians, many Legs feel that to live ethically one must follow a moral code which maintains a reciprocal relationship between humans, the land, and the realm of spirits in which the ancestors dwell. Eva or called this keeping the Legs way. The ideal of keeping the Legs way requires that people not take for their own gain but instead give back by following a cultural ethic of egalitarianism, reciprocity and peaceful living. Or was acknowledged as spiritual leader. A Clackwill. Marilyn James states that Or got her authority as a Clackwilt by being culturally whole, linguistically connected to Sinixt culture, and bringing people to spirit. The Sinixt connection to the traditional territory is underscored by the Ubaplakane, the highest territorial and cultural legal doctrine of the Sinixt, which sets out the territorial responsibility to all land, water, plant, animal and cultural resources within the Cynics territory. Cynics in the group's Northern Territory host a bi-weekly radio program, Cynics Radio, on Nelson, BC. Community radio station CJLY-FM. The Northern Cynics also host an annual Bat Affair every fall in Valakan, BC. The event features live music and performance, and it is set up to encourage local bartering of goods and services. Notable Cynics people in Washington. One particular family of Cynics have figured prominently among recent-day urban Indians. Bernie White Bear, a Seattle Indian rights activist and founder of several urban Indian organizations, was declared Washington State's first citizen of the decade in November 1997. His sister Luana Reyes was, at the time of her death, deputy director of the U.S.'s 14,000-person Indian Health Services, and the brother Lonnie Reyes is a Seattle-based sculptor, designer, curator and author. Lonnie, Luana and Bernie are descendants of Alex Christian, whose family lived at Kapitles, a Cynics village, for generations, until the Canadian government sold their land to settlers. Novelist and memoirist Okanagan Mourning Dove, also known as Christine Quintaskit, is described by anthropologist Paula Price as being of Cynics Skoyelpi descent, and Quintaskit described her childhood and youth at Pia in the late 19th, early 20th century. Quintaskit was one of the first Native American women to publish a novel. Joe Federson is a Cynics Okanagan sculptor, painter, photographer and mixed media artist born in Omak, Washington.